Hi, everyone. This is lecture 5.1, Putting Immigration in Historic Context. In this lecture, we will be talking about issues surrounding immigration. We will also be talking about important historical moments when that contributed to the current situation of what immigration and immigration law look like in the United States today. So we'll be talking first of all about some common misconceptions about modern immigrants. Some of those do also apply to previous generations of immigrants. We'll then talk about historic context and contemporary issues in immigration itself. So being born in this country is a source of privilege, and that's important to note when talking about immigration, right? We've talked about, and there are many conversations about privilege. What does it mean to be a white man? Well, it gains you a certain privilege in terms of race. It gains you a certain privilege in terms of sex. Well, another area of privilege that people could have in the United States is being a native born to the United States. That is a source of privilege, and it's a colossal source of privilege, actually, in terms of the law. So, yeah, just like those privilege enjoyed by men, white people, straight people, etc. American citizens, it should be noted, and we often don't talk about this in conversations about immigration, we have different rights compared to people who are non-citizens. We have greater, and I'm saying we because I'm part of that group, right? We have different legal power. We have other cultural advantages as well in terms of compared to non-citizens. So, for example, I don't have to, well, and this is also in terms of race too, right? I am white. Nobody is going to ask me to show any kind of documentation of my legal citizenship to the United States because we assume that white people are automatically citizens of the United States, especially, and this goes along with culture, we talk about accent. I may have a semi-quirky Pennsylvania-esque accent, but that is definitely an American mode of speaking. And nobody's going to think I'm a non-citizen. Nobody's going to tell me to go back where I came from because of what I personally look like. And another source of privilege is that American citizens often ignore or forget how hard it is to be a non-citizen. There are many, many rights afforded to us, to citizens living in this country, and a lot of those rights are not afforded to non-citizens. And we'll talk about that more as we go through this lecture. So a question that comes up, or maybe a question that people have for themselves that they find an answer to, is why would people immigrate illegally? Sometimes there's an assumption that immigrating illegally makes you greatly immoral. Maybe you're too lazy to go through the legal immigration process. Maybe you want to try to do some illegal things when you come to this country, and that's why you're doing it that way. The fact of the matter is that the legal immigration process is an incredibly slow and incredibly complex process. It does require a degree of middle-class cultural capital. So you'll remember from Sociology 101 when we discussed cultural capital. Those are the knowledges that we have that make us aware of what needs to be done in a given situation, right? And legal knowledge is where to file paperwork, how to file paperwork, how to get that done and in on time. Those are all things that children of middle class status and maybe American citizens would know more about as compared to people that come from other places who aren't used to those kinds of procedures. Many immigrants that come to the United States are from working and lower classes. Thus, they do not have that middle class cultural capital that is required to do the legal immigration process properly. That is then exaggerated upon by the fact that many people, when they first come to the United States, do not speak fluent English, and they may not read fluent English as well. And we'll talk about language in a little bit when we talk about historic context. There are many people that like to discriminate against immigrants because they don't necessarily speak full and fluent English, and that is simply not an excuse. And additionally, there are many people that come here to the United States are in a desperate financial situation as well. They're not following the law because they want to break the law. Many people are not following the law even if they know about the law because they are in a desperate financial or possibly even for their life situation when they flee. And that's important to remember. Another important thing to remember about immigration is that border issues are not new. Migrant labor traditions are older than our modern borders even are. As long as we have been doing agriculture in the South and the Southwest, there have been workers moving from farm to farm picking crops. And many of those workers have come from the area that is now Mexico. When Mexico, the Southwest was part of Mexico prior to the Spanish-American War, then that flow was, well, I won't necessarily say it's easy because it was a long time ago and there were other barriers, but that flow wasn't even noticed, right? And then when that cultural shift happened, when that border moved and border changed, then yes, those tides of workers were going over a border, but that's just kind of how agriculture works. Woody Guthrie, it should be noted, you may know Woody Guthrie if you're a real big folk music nerd like I am. Woody Guthrie, one of his more famous songs from the 1930s was about a plane full of Mexican migrant workers who died in a plane crash. And they were being deported after they were done doing the farming work that they were there to do. And the song's all about how, well, isn't it interesting that they didn't deport them while they were working for the American farmer? And isn't it tragic that no one seems to care about this plane full of people who are just labeled as deportees? It's a really touching, beautiful song. Woody Guthrie stuff's just amazing, but that's just a side point. So talking a little bit about Guthrie, let's talk more about historic context of immigration, because as with all things, history matters, culture matters, and you need to remember and understand those things to understand where we are today. So I'm going the whole way back. The American, well, not the whole way back, because there's a lot of people that immigrated before Europeans even got here. I'm starting with Europeans. First, the English immigrate to the colonies that they set up as British colonies. So those were those original 13 colonies of the United States. And shortly after that period started, in the year 1619, African slaves began to be brought to the colonies. Those weren't immigrants per se, but they were people who were kidnapped and brought from other places in order to live in the United States, given as property, but they were still here. So there are English people here, there are African slaves here, and then waves of immigrants following those first immigrants came. The first big wave of immigration were people from Germany. Most of those people from Germany landed in Pennsylvania. And I have the years, and I didn't put the years there. That was about from the mid-1600s, and that first wave of immigration was still about the end of the 1700s. Those people were fleeing as refugees themselves of war from the 30 Years' War. So those are people who were fleeing for their lives, just like many of the immigrants today are fleeing for their lives. These immigrants, these German immigrants, continued to speak their native language for generations after they came to the United States. This document you see here is a birth certificate from the year 1817. Or that could be 1807, I can't quite read it. From the limited German I know, I can tell you that he was delivered by a housewife in his house, that he was in the state of Pennsylvania, it says right here, in North America, that, and these are the names of his parents right here. And so, this is in the year 1807. This is in all likelihood of Pennsylvania Dutch origin. And this is my cultural background, so I know a little bit more about it. The Pennsylvania Dutch still speak a language called Pennsylvania Dutch, right? There are still people who are still speaking a non-English language of their ancestors prior to when they came to the United States. And oftentimes, people who speak Spanish are harassed because, this is America, why don't you speak English? Well, quite frankly, there are a lot of people that came to the United States that didn't immediately convert to speaking English, and they were allowed to do that too. In the 1800s, the second wave of German immigration happened. That was into the northern part of the country and into the northern Midwest. So we are talking about people who are up in Minnesota, up in North Dakota and South Dakota. Then, after that second wave of German immigration, Italian citizens started coming to the United States. And then, as the Irish potato famine happened in the 1850s, if I'm correct, then that immigration happened as well. Again, desperate people coming to the United States, right? Doing it as cheaply as they can. If those people could have walked, if those people wouldn't have had to file government paperwork, I'm sure many of them would have done that as well. And then Chinese people started to come toward the end of the 1800s. Toward the end of the 1800s, we start to see more immigrants coming from Asian countries. A lot of that is because communications technologies and transportation technologies start to improve during that era. Similarly, in that era, in 1882, we have the first of the Chinese Exclusion Acts. The Chinese Exclusion Act specifically was focused on Chinese people coming to the western United States, Oregon, Washington, and they were helping build the railroads. But racist individuals became concerned that they were going to be quote unquote, outnumbered by Chinese people. So they passed an act to limit immigration. The Chinese Exclusion Act is just one of the acts that did that. And in that limiting of Chinese people, what they're saying is, well, it's fine if white people come to the United States, but if you're not white, then we don't necessarily want you coming. And then that was legally resolved in the 1900s. In the early 1900s, there were large waves of Eastern European Jews coming to the United States, and this was prior to World War II, actually. The biggest wave was prior to World War I. Most of those Eastern European Jews wound up in the New York City metropolitan area, and that is still a major ethnic center for that specific ethnicity. And then we started to get more restricted of that around World War II till about 1950. Immigration drops massively to the United States in that World War II to 1950 zone. Then in 1952, the Illegal Immigrant Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act was authorized, in which the Attorney General reserved the right to detain non-citizens while they await deportation hearings. What does that mean? That means that law clamped down on people for the first time who came to the United States, who were unable to actually go through those official government channels, and that they were going to be taken somewhere else. Most of those people in that era were people who came up over via land, over the land-Mexico border, right? Because if you're going to move physically over a space, it's harder to do that over the ocean. Now, some of those people also, many of them, non-citizens, were people who stayed over on their visa. Many of those people may have originally come over legally, but they lost track, or maybe they weren't informed, or something happened along those lines. That Immigrant Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, that is highlighted on this slide because that ability of the Attorney General to detain non-citizens while they await deportation hearings, that is a major part of our immigration issues to this day in terms of immigration detention, and it set a precedent that allowed for the detaining of non-citizens in prison-like settings that we see along the southern border to this day. In 1965, we see movement with the Immigration and Nationality Act that drops nationality quotas, right? So this is the part that took a lot of the racism out of immigration to the United States. So it dropped European nationality quotas and it allowed for an increase in legal immigration from Latin America. So it actually did ease some of that illegality element to it because it was very difficult to legally come to the United States from Latin America prior to that era. So it became a little bit better, but it was still, and to this day, it still remains greatly problematic. So in terms of Donald Trump's rhetoric around immigration, his rhetoric is staunchly anti-immigrant, but it should be pointed out that national policy has not changed since he has become president. He has not passed any laws, has not passed any policy, official government policy that has said that we are stopping immigration. Now, what he has done is passed several executive orders. So those executive orders that he's passed are shorter, smaller pieces of law that the next president that comes in after him, or even he could do it too, has the capacity of just removing those and say, no, we are not going to push that as the executive branch anymore. So basically what Trump has put into law at this point does not have to be permanent, is the short end of it. But what is permanent is that the restrictions and deportations that have occurred since Trump has taken office, most of them have taken place using the framework of pre-Trump policy. So there were a lot of immigrations that occurred when Obama was in office as well. And a lot of those deportations occurred on the same basis as the vast majority of the Trump deportations as well. So it's important to put things into context. The reason why people are deported is not all because the president has taken a staunchly anti-immigrant stance, but that staunchly anti-immigrant stance definitely has an influence on the entire system surrounding immigration. So it's important when talking about any of these to take the law into account. And whenever something directly talks on the Bill of Rights or other parts of the Constitution, it is important to review that to know possibly what your legal rights are. So the Fifth Amendment reads in its entirety, and not all of that applies to what we're talking about, but it says, no person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise, or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury, except in case arising in the land or naval forces or in the militia. So what's that saying? If you're in the military, then you don't have, there's a different view. Nor shall any person be subject to the same offense, do twice put in jeopardy of life or limb, nor shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself. And that's often what we think about as the Fifth Amendment. But the Fifth Amendment also says, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. That blue part and that green part are really important when we're talking about immigration rights. The blue part states that no person, not no citizen, no person shall be deprived of life, be killed, have their liberty taken away, so be put in prison, or property have your property taken from you, nor, in the green, shall your property be taken without compensating you. And a lot of that property without compensating you is happening on the southern border today. And a lot of that liberty element of people being held and not being allowed to leave is also happening. And we'll go through that in these following slides, because now that we've worked through the history of it, we're going to talk about what's happening in a policy sense. So the Immigration Nationality Act of 1996 expanded the number of offenses that allowed legal permanent residents to be eligible for deportation, and several groups of immigrants are now subject to detention without bond review. So what does that mean? That takes that old 1956 model, right, saying that we are allowed to put people who are in this country that don't have their proper paperwork filed, we're allowed to put you in prison. Well, the Immigration Nationality Act of 1996 expanded that capacity and took legal residents, people who did actually do it legally, and those people are now capable of being deported as well. In addition, we don't have to necessarily review your legal case. We can just take you and get rid of you. This includes minor legal infractions such as parking violations or other minor legal elements. Additionally, detainees apprehended upon arrival in the United States, including asylum seekers who fled their country due to persecution. So once you get to a border checkpoint, you are in the United States. And at that point, you can be detained. And even if you are fleeing because you are fleeing a war, just like many other immigrants in the past had fled for that reason, we can just deport you effectively because we don't want you in the country. There are asylum protocols and protocols for filing for asylum, but that is an element that has been weakened by Trump's executive orders. And then furthermore, Section 287G of the Immigration Nationality Act states that federal-state partnership programs is put into effect, thus allowing federal government to shift immigration enforcement to state and local enforcement. That is a really interesting element considering what we are talking about in terms of sanctuary cities, which we will talk about what exactly is a sanctuary city. That directly relates to 287G in that those localities are not participating in this, and that's a really interesting part of it. But also part of 287G is the criminal alien program, which helps secure removal orders for immigrants who are being held in local, state, or federal prisons prior to their release, effectively stating that if you happen to break the law, or even if you don't necessarily break the law, but you get put in jail for any reason, it makes it much easier to deport you, is what that element does right there. Now, there is an important historic milestone. I mean, 9/11, September 11th, 2001 was incredibly influential in the United States for many, many reasons, but we are on the topic of immigration. And 9/11, the laws that came into effect after 9/11 definitely set a legal precedent and impacts our contemporary immigration issues. If you know anything about the law, you know that setting legal precedent is a major, major, major thing. So once a law is put into place, it can then be put in the future used to form further laws. And if nobody challenges it, if there isn't a legal challenge, then that's pretty much the law as it's going to be, unless it goes up against the Supreme Court. So, following 9/11, laws were put into place that made possible large-scale detention and deportation of thousands of undocumented residents in federal, state, county, and private facilities. That is what put into place and allowed for the family detention camps along the southern border and other places in this country that are being run by ICE. And that seems to fall into that blue portion that that is specifically not allowed in the Fifth Amendment, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Remember, the Fifth Amendment does not say no citizen. The Fifth Amendment says no person, right? And without due process of law is generally accepted to mean without, there has to be a limit to it. At this point, there are people being held, quote unquote, indefinitely, so for as long as we want to, and they're not being filed properly and being assured a court date or a proper trial. And that is setting up what I am sure eventually will be a very, very, very big court case. Maybe not necessarily tomorrow, because these things take time, unfortunately. But we're going to see a major court case on this in the next decade or so. I'm pretty confident of that. So when we talk about, just flip back here for a second, the detention and private facilities, it is important to know what we're talking about when we're talking about private detention facilities, because it is unknown how many private detention centers ICE operates. These centers are not overseen by agencies outside of ICE or DHS, so immigration, I'm sorry, let me do something. I have it somewhere else in here. Sorry. Oh well. Sorry, I left it out. I can't remember what the C in ICE stands for. Oh yeah, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. That's what ICE stands for. Sorry. Is part of DHS. So ICE is part of the Department of Homeland Security, and ICE facilities have been accused of not providing sufficient oversight to these facilities. So what are we saying here is that we have places that we are keeping people that are not being properly monitored, right? We have closed systems and people are being put there, and people outside of those facilities don't know where those people are or who those people are. Well, so what? Well, thousands of children are being kept in these facilities and they're not being appropriately overseen. And these children are not getting the food, the water, the medical attention that they need. And children have already died because of this. There are children who are separated from their families that there's a distinct possibility they may never see their families again. And these are really little children. And as a father, I find that, and as a human, I find that deeply, deeply troubling. If you want to read more about this, by the time this gets to you, this article might be relatively dated, but there's if you follow that website, I know it's a long chain of address, but you can get to a newspaper, a pretty good news source. NBC News isn't as biased as MSNBC is, about immigrant children who have died while in ICE custody. It's deeply, deeply and intensely troubling. So the Patriot Act also, which is that bit I talked about that came into place immediately following 9/11, this is the big piece of legislation that allowed the groundwork for this kind of influx of immigration detention. And it's important to keep in mind that the Patriot Act is kind of demonized by people today as, oh, what a big super government piece of legislation. But immediately following 9/11, the Patriot Act was passed 1 month later, and it was popular. There was only one senator in all of Congress that opposed it. That was Russ Feingold from Wisconsin. He was the only person that said, "Hey, we shouldn't pass that. There's some big problems here." And the Patriot Act expanded search and seizure capacities for government agencies. So it allowed government agencies to search our homes in a way and to search our electronic records in a way that were not we're not really allowed. And that element of the Fifth Amendment, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation, that has in the past been interpreted to mean that government enforcement agencies cannot just come into our house and take a look around. That's what it meant prior to the Patriot Act. Since the Patriot Act, and a lot of that hasn't been challenged, it's kind of eroded our capacity to make those arguments. Additionally, the Patriot Act in 2001 created the Department of Homeland Security. Prior to 2001, there was no Department of Homeland Security, and without the Department of Homeland Security being formed, ICE would not exist. It's important to keep in mind, Immigration and Customs Enforcement did not exist prior to 2003. They're not an established organization like the FBI is, or even like a lot of our police forces are. They're pretty young, and a young organization is one that can definitely have flaws. And a young organization is also one that you could argue maybe doesn't need to exist. So, as I mentioned, the Patriot Act created DHS, etc. It was founded in 2003 largely to monitor immigrants who could be potential terrorists. That's why DHS and why ICE was created. At that time, it's important to keep in mind that our prejudices that impact our government can flux, right? At that time, we were most concerned with Muslims or Middle Easterners or that group of people. If you're going to refer to a group of people from the Middle East, it's Arab Americans, people from the Middle East, etc. To call them all of those people Muslims is inaccurate because there are Jews in those areas, there are atheists in those areas. There's a lot of people who aren't Muslims in those areas, but that was cultural fear, right? The shorthand for that group of brown people was Muslims, and that's what people were afraid of when we passed the Patriot Act. Now, after the Patriot Act was passed in 2001 and then ICE was created in 2003, the Secure Border Initiative's SBI of 2005 went into place. This was a plan to secure American borders and decrease unauthorized migration. So, thus, this was put into place to bring that war on terror to the southern border. So there was a concern, at least the way it was portrayed in the media during that era, that, Muslim operatives, again, the term Muslim was used to mean terrorist, which is deeply offensive. But Al-Qaeda operatives, what are now ISIS operatives, were thought that, maybe they could come up over the southern border, so we need to crack down on the southern border. Phase one of that was expanded personnel and tech use on borders to restructure the system for detention and removal of unauthorized immigrants already in the country. So that does involve a lot of the types of deportation that we see today, the raids on people's houses that we see today, and also increased use of cameras that we see today. And then phase two of that was ICE announcing that they would no longer, quote, tolerate illegal employment or illegal immigration in the United States. And this was followed by a series of workplace raids. More than 2,000 people were arrested in these raids. We don't know exactly how many because ICE does not tend to report those numbers to outside of DHS or ICE. So we don't really know. This will be a major point, I'm sure, of historical contention in the near future, I'm sure. But since 2005, really it was around 2007 when this really kicked into place, ICE has been doing these periodic raids, are going into people's workplaces, going into people's homes and arresting them because they did not have the proper paperwork filed with the government. The National Fugitives Operations Program, NFOP, was created to locate and deport, quote, dangerous fugitive aliens as part of a new funding initiative. What this means is that between 2003 and 2009, funding to this program and other ICE programs increased 23 times. You can see a really good illustration of that on page 90 of our text. You see that their funding went from $9 million to $208 million. And when we talk about bills and numbers that big, right? Imagine that one of your bills that you pay every month went from $9 a month to $218 a month. Take that into consideration. That's a really massive increase in funding. So what does NFOP mean? It means that in that time period, in around 2006 or so, funding to deport people and what is a dangerous fugitive alien is really up to really vague debate, but funding to deport people from the United States went up a massive amount in that time period. I am sorry, this is a little bit of a rehash from the previous slide. To put this into context, between 2003 and 2009, 96,000 people were deported by NFOP. To put that into context, 76,000 people live in Valencia, right? So more than Valencia was deported during that time. And 73% of those people, so it talks about here in the previous slide about dangerous fugitive aliens, 73% of those people had no criminal conviction. No criminal conviction. And that appears to be a severe violation of nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, right? So from a sociological standpoint, I am pretty confident saying that this is a dysfunctional element in our society. People are trying to solve what they perceive to be a dangerous element in the Southwest, but with 73% of the people being deported with no criminal conviction, apparently not hurting anybody, it appears to be a problem. Now, there is a lot of talk about sanctuary cities, and there is talk about what can be done on a local political level. A sanctuary city is a local government. A city is really a loose term. Local governments that have passed policies or proclamations that local law enforcement will not cooperate with ICE or participate in ICE raids or investigations. That works on a case-by-case basis on each state and local government. The big part of what it does is going back to that previous bit that we talked about regarding legislation in the early 2000s, where ICE would start cooperating to a greater degree with local law enforcement. Well, what this says is local law enforcement says, no, we will not do that. What exactly a sanctuary city looks like on a case-by-case basis means that they each kind of go along a little bit differently. So the laws, what I actually talked to a legislator about this, and he said that, each sanctuary city pretty much has to make up their own rules for it. So it's not really legally that it's legally structured, but how exactly to do it is a difficult process. So this isn't directly related to sanctuary cities, but it is directly related to where ICE has jurisdiction. So this red line is within 100 miles of the border, and that's where ICE has jurisdiction. You'll notice all of Hawaii, all of Florida, the state of Maine, most of New England. There's just a whole lot of territory there, and most of our country's major cities are in this territorial area. You will note, though, that ICE does not have jurisdictions when you go a little bit more inland. The entire state of Colorado right here, a good chunk of New Mexico, ICE does not have jurisdiction. Interestingly to me, right here is where Columbus is. On the northern, about a quarter of my city is within ICE jurisdiction, and most of the city isn't. And we are actually a sanctuary city here in Columbus. So Columbus is an okay place to be an immigrant in unless you go to the north side, which is absolutely bizarre because, like, I'm in the smack middle of Ohio. Nobody thinks of Columbus as being anywhere near the border, but they have jurisdiction here. And then you compare that to this slide, and you see these points are where the sanctuary cities are. You'll see Columbus, Ohio right there. Many of these sanctuary cities are within the zone of where ICE has jurisdiction, but you will note there's a big cluster of them in Colorado, a big cluster of them up in the Midwest. A lot of places are both sanctuary cities and are not within the jurisdiction of ICE. So those, and there's a couple of those here in New Mexico as well. So those are probably good areas for people who are either legal or not legal immigrants, right? To minimize harassing from these government officials and government agencies. Specifically within New Mexico, Bernalillo, I know I'm probably saying that wrong, Bernalillo County is a, quote, sanctuary city. San Miguel is a sanctuary city. And this really ties in with the fact that it doesn't have to be a city as per se, but the New Mexico County jails, the jails, not the prisons, but the jails, they have said that they will not participate in ICE raids and ICE actions. They've at least said that. Whether they're doing it or not is another story, but they have taken those measures as well. So just because stuff is happening all around us does not mean that there aren't fights taking place and people in government taking place. And when a city passes sanctuary city proclamations, they are saying, we do not agree with what's happening on the federal level, on the federal government level. That doesn't make them unpatriotic. There are people who would argue that that makes them even more patriotic. This is a really intensely controversial issue for our society. And this issue specifically may be one of the things that this era of American history will be known for. So this is the stuff your grandkids will ask you about. This is really interesting stuff. Okay, so that is our lecture for this time. I look forward to our conversations about this stuff, and I hope I taught you some, and thanks for listening.